Right. Well, first of all, thanks to everybody who was here this morning and shared the American Doll stories. So today is really all about stories and different ways of telling stories and different ways of learning stories. Some stories are passed down from generation to generation. And that's the type of story that I'm going to be telling this afternoon. Well, we're still in the morning here in Colorado. So many years ago, when I was a new curator, I got a frantic phone call from a patron. And she said, I have this wonderful signature quilt that has ink signatures. And it's related to North Carolina, which is where we were. However, I didn't want you to see it until it was clean. And so I put it in the washing machine. And when I took it out of the dryer, all the signatures have disappeared. And what do I say? That was a real stupid thing to do. No, Southern lady. No, I said, I'm sorry, unless we can find a formula to reverse the ink that disappeared, I think that your signatures are simply lost to the washing machine and the dryer. That was my introduction to curating quilts.
Very cool.
But it was something that we, in the textile lab, we weren't a department. We were sometimes 3 people, sometimes 4 people. But we learned to expect the unexpected when the phone rang. But that was a great story to bring today. And I'm from the oohs and ahs and the oh no's. I think everyone in this group has a better sense of how to take care of their family quilts. So, what we're going to do today, for my part of the talks, is I'm going to talk about a method of doing research. First of all, if you have on a curator's hat, to verify the stories that patrons bring to you. For example, if the day comes, when the day comes, when the 2 quilts I brought will be passed on to an institution, and that curator looks at me and says, well, that's a great story, but prove it to me. I will be able to do that. And then, on the other hand, as the family person who has been entrusted with the custody of everything, my family, both sides, we have things from Roger's family, both sides. We just need to verify the family stories that we've been told. So how do you do that? What is that kind of research? And then the last 3 slides that I'll have for you are about examples of resources and some of their challenges and shortcomings. And to just give one example in advance, what I found in all of the census records that are handwritten, enumerators, they were called enumerators. Some of them had beautiful penmanship. Some of them you can't hardly read. Some of them could spell, or they asked their informants to spell. Others made up the spelling and just spelled it phonetically. And some of them maybe couldn't hear very well. And so you have to verify even a primary source document. So here we go. We're going to tell the story of the 2 quilts I brought. Next slide, honey. All right, so I'm going to introduce you to what would be my great-grandparents, Jasper and Ellen Bonham, who lived in Illinois. Jasper was a farmer. They married in 1861, and they had 10 children, which, if you look at the census records, and Heidi is giving me support back there, this is not uncommon at this time in our history. And the children were spaced about 2 years apart. So, 10 children. William Russell became a Methodist minister. Albert, my grandfather, became a cowboy. So we're veering off. We're going to follow Albert through this. Henry. John was a farmer. The daughter who lived to adulthood, Elizabeth, married, became a wife and mother. Charles Clinton became a barber. He was the only city folk, if you call a little settlement on the frontier a city. Franklin, another Methodist minister. George and Fred, the little boys in front in this portrait, became farmers. And the names listed in red all moved from Illinois to Oklahoma. There was a baby Ida, the last child born, and she lived about a year, and she's buried in Illinois. So, Jasper and Ellen, Albert, Henry, John, Charles, George, and Fred came to Oklahoma. Now, what was the lure? My all-time favorite professor of history at Phoenix College would begin and end every history class with this. It's all about land. Pete Demas, quotation. It's all about land. So, now we're going to follow my grandfather Henry. Henry is the only one of his siblings who became a cowboy. Brothers were ministers, they were thinking about going into farming, but Henry must have had the wanderlust to say, hey guys, Mom, I'm going to leave Illinois and I'm going to Texas and I'm going to be a cowboy. And he did. And so I found this wonderful map that shows the major cattle trails from San Antonio area where the herds would form and the drives would begin northward. And they were headed to the railroad lines. So, here's Henry from that portrait, which is a real family treasure. And this is my image of Henry. Now, I'm from Fort Worth, Texas, and grew up with Remington and Russell images and cowboy stories and statues and so forth. But this is the image that I think, well, that might have been Henry. This is the only picture of his youth that I have. So I substitute this for the action shot, and this is called The Puncher, 1895 by Frederick Remington. So we can put those together and come up with an image of Henry. So we know for a fact from the family stories and from Henry himself that he herded cattle on the Chisholm Trail. Therefore, he would be familiar with Fort Worth, Texas. That was the official beginning of the Chisholm Trail. I think, this is my hypothesis, Henry also joined crews that were going on the Great Trail to the west. Let me point that out. It's this one. It's a western, the Great Western Trail. Because if he hadn't have done that with his fellow cowboys, how would he have known about that little corner of Oklahoma? Okay? So we know how he knew about Fort Worth. I have a theory as to how he knew about this corner of Oklahoma. So Henry made these trips, how many times? I do not know, but on the Chisholm and on the Great Western Trail. And then after the trail, they deposited the cattle there at the railroad yards. He'd probably go on back to Illinois and visit his mom and his dad and the brothers who were still there. The preachers were out preaching, so we call them circuit riders. Okay. So he would bring back stories. So he was kind of the communication agent of his generation. And I think he went back home and he said to his dad and to his brothers, there's good land in Oklahoma, in the territory, and it is about to open for settlement. I don't know about the rest of you. I would love for you all to come. I'm going to Oklahoma. So that is what he did. So he persuaded his dad and 5 of his siblings to relocate to Cordell, what became Cordell, Oklahoma, in what we pronounce as Washita County in the Oklahoma area. Okay. Next slide. So here, Roger and I got an in-depth lesson in homesteading. We go to the county courthouse, and we've been there twice, and find the most wonderful staff willing to help us. And they print out for us the entire modern county of Washita County, and it's divided into these pieces of land in preparation for opening land ownership to the settlers. So I have kind of doctored this one up a little bit, but here's what we learned. What I've highlighted in yellow, you'll see, is a big square. And this square is 6 miles by 6 miles. And then the surveyors continue and divide that into smaller squares. And in the 6 square mile piece of land, then you have 36 pieces of land. And you look how they number them, which I think is fascinating. Let's take this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Make a U-turn. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And a U-turn. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and so on. So the yellow is 6 by 6 miles. It's divided into 36 sections. But if you homesteaded, think of that movie Far and Away.
Yeah.
Uncle Albert was blind in one eye. He was in a buggy for the land run in 1892. You were running for not the full section, but a quarter of a section. And a quarter of a section became a homestead. So remember, 2 of the little brothers were too young to be landowners. But here we've got 1892. We got Albert, Henry, and John. They were together here. We have Charles and Jasper here, and then here's someone with a different last name, Clark Crickbaum. Henry will eventually marry Clark's daughter, Fanny. Okay, see how this is all coming together? Now they were up in Nebraska and they came down. So we've got Illinois, Nebraska, we've got a little Texas, we've got a little Oklahoma. We also wanted to visit the cemeteries to verify birth and death dates. Here's Strickland Cemetery and here's Sod Cemetery. And so the staff at the courthouse sent us out into the prairie with this map, and we drove by all 6 of the homesteads, and we took photographs and videos. That type of research out in the field is just so rewarding, and it helps the stories come to life. So continuing to follow Henry. So 1892, that's where we are now. Henry homesteaded the 160 acres, plenty of family there. He married Fanny Maud Nobby Crickbaum in 1894. She was the local school marm. He built a farmhouse. Now here is what it looked like in 1995. It has since started to further decay, and I have a scheme for my cousins to bring their pickup trucks from Fort Worth up to Cordell and salvage some of this lumber so we can have a tabletop made. But that's a scheme at this point. Built a barn. Henry and Fanny had 13 children. Boom, 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 every other year. 9 of whom lived to be adults. Typical story. So there's the farm bell, which the family still has. This is the youngest looking picture of Fanny that I could find. That's the farmhouse. And this is Henry's land. Right here, there's that farmhouse. Coming down one of those roads, and it's in a perfect grid, mile per mile. Roger can go right to it. He's from Kansas, and he understands those sections of land. So that's Henry's place right there. You can see here, there was a creek. If you got a creek, you're going to have a soddy, and most of this generation lived in a soddy house made of sod when they first got there, but they had to make improvements at some point. All right, so here's another source that we've used. Anyone ever heard of the WPA? Okay, Works Progress Administration. So I delved into WPA interviews done in the 1930s, and I found Albert, whose land was adjacent to Henry's, looks just like that. And I found Mrs. John Bonham, and this was a lesson to me in naming traditions, because the women are not going by their own given name. So I would be Mrs. Roger Berger, and she was Mrs. John Bonham. So these interviews are transcribed, and they are available to be searched online. And here I found two of this generation. So first, we'll get just a few paragraphs, because just think how honored they must have been in the 1930s to talk about the 1890s and the teens. So this is interview with Mrs. John Bonham, done in July of 1937, another primary source. The year of 1896 was very hard for us in Texas, as we had not made any crops. In the fall of '96, we got a card from our brother Henry Bonham telling us to come to Oklahoma, that we could buy land real cheap there. So my husband John went to Oklahoma in a wagon to see how things really were. Okay, now this is quite long, and I'm just going to do a few paragraphs from a woman's perspective. There was a store, a post office, a hotel, and a few other buildings 1.5 miles east of where Cordell is located now. Cloud Chief was the county seat. I had never lived in a dugout. When I saw where I had to live with a baby, I cried and begged John to go back to Texas. We stayed in this place in February 1897 and have been living here ever since. We lived in the dugout for 3 years until it rained so hard that one of them caved in, and we borrowed $100 from a neighbor, could have been his brother or his dad, and hauled lumber from El Reno, the closest railroad, and built 2 rooms, 14 by 28. We did most of our trading at Cloud Chief. It would take all day to go there and back in a covered wagon, but we would go there to have picnics and barbecues and stay all night. So you see, there was this sense of community already. We have raised 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. One boy is a doctor. He was bitten by a rattlesnake when a small boy, but he recovered. One boy is a druggist. One girl is a nurse, and we got a nurse out on the prairie. And all are married except one boy, and he is still at home with my husband and me. We have been living here for 40 years on this place. We came here with 50 cents and now have 480 acres of land and plenty of everything. It isn't so bad after all here in Oklahoma. Now, we'll go for a few.
What year was that? What year was that?
37, during the Depression. It was the interview. Yeah. So now,
Vicki, very
yes.
quickly, just 2 lines, what was the WPA?
Okay, all right. The 1930s brought the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and people were out of work and crops were failing. And so the federal government had various programs to build things, and for different professions there were different projects. So if you were a builder or you were young and strong, you might be building roads or buildings as akin to the CCC. And so for artists and teachers and so forth. They could write, they could type. So there was a corps of interviewers who went out to conduct these interviews, and it's a wonderful resource. Okay, next primary source is Uncle Albert. He's the one in the portrait that had the patch over one eye. A bachelor fellow, next door to one of his brothers. Albert said, I landed here on September 3rd, 1892. I filed on 160 acres of land 3 miles south and 1/2 mile west of the place where present Cordell Depot is now. I built a dugout. Everybody had a dugout at first. I built a dugout to live in, and I brought a yoke of oxen to this country, and I sodded my land, working those oxen in an old sod walking plow. Feed crops were all we raised. But I know from my mother's stories, later they raised cotton, because all the kids.
Yeah.
There were 31 cousins. With all these brothers, there were 31 first cousins, and they all picked cotton. Okay. I bought hens for $8 a dozen. I sold eggs for 5 cents a dozen, and when I raised cotton, I had to hire a man to haul it to Duncan, where I would get 4 cents a pound for it. We lived with snakes, centipedes, and fleas. Very pleasant. And he says our dugout, he had a hired help who lived with him to help with all the farming. Our dugout was full of them. One night, a snake got in bed with me. It was so cold to my back that it scared me at first, but then I realized what it was, so I got up and killed it. When I first came here I found some textile references. When I first came here, I also ran a peddling wagon. I would go to El Reno and buy some calico oilcloth and a few tin cooking vessels. Then I would start out, trade my things for chickens, then take the chickens to Vernon, Texas, and sell the chickens. So he ends with, I'm a very old man and I can't work. So I sit around and think of those old times. They were very hard times, but very happy. I am blind in both eyes, but I enjoy music very much. That's important. I play the violin quite a bit, and I used to play for the Indian dances. So, Albert and Henry, who also inherited the music gene, had a musicale every Wednesday night, whether it was in that dugout or after they built their farmhouses. And everybody came. Everybody who wanted to came, and they sang and they played and they danced. And that's where it happened. Okay, next slide, honey. So, when you think about that life, it's amazing that I have 2 quilts to bring to you today from this very area in Oklahoma. So, Henry and Fanny lived there until they moved to Texas. Years later, they became respected members of the community. Fanny taught school until, I guess, there were too many kids to raise herself. They were members of the Methodist Church, as the 2 big brothers who are Methodist ministers, and they were active supporters of the local schools. Music was so important in this pioneer family. Henry played the mandolin, and here we have a visual aid unexpected. We have an American Doll mandolin. He played the mandolin, and Albert played his fiddle. The Bonhams hosted weekly Wednesday night, and I've got that from my mother. It was on Wednesday night. Music house, neighbors and friends came, and in the next generation of the 13 kids, Ruth, my mom, got the music gene. Fanny was, as I said, a school teacher with absolutely gorgeous penmanship, and she was also used to public speaking, not only kids, but the community. And she would give these rousing speeches to this pioneer community I have a copy of her speech. She is advocating for all of the farmers to buy war bonds for World War I. And she says, my oldest son is in France, and I'm standing here today to urge you to support my son and your sons who are fighting in France. So she was quite a lady, quite a lady. During the 30s, the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl affected the rural community as it did the country. Finally, Fanny and Henry decided to move to Fort Worth following their oldest daughter, who had already moved with her husband. And a grateful community presented to them this beautiful quilt. And this quilt is on the table over there for us to look at this afternoon. And we have some details. Now, this is a curator's dream, let alone the daughter who was entrusted with this treasure. It says, presented to Mr. and Mrs. H. Bonham by Shiloh Friends, 1934. Shiloh refers to the school where all the 31 cousins went to school, and there's an exact date. And just a few technical aspects. It's 88 inches long, 81 inches wide. It has rounded corners, so we'll be sure and fold up a corner so you can see it. It has this wonderful border and green binding. And thanks to Newbie and her friend Virginia, this pattern is a local variation of something called Puss in the Corner. Now, my eyesight is not good enough to count stitches per inch, but Bruce has loaned me a magnifying glass, and we have Sally's measuring tape. So if anyone can count stitches, please help me out there. Okay, thank you, honey. And just a few of those blocks. From this side over, there's Mrs. John Bonham, who was interviewed by the WPA interviewer. Minnie Bonham, my hunch is she's some kind of cousin, a niece or somebody, but she's one of the Bonhams. Mrs. Woodrow Bonham, Maxine, is my Uncle Woody's wife. So there's her square. And then some more. There are two of these that have the beautiful little embroidery. And you can see how evidently people made their own, because look how different they are, especially the pink one. Okay? Entirely plain. Okay. So, Henry and Fanny retired from farming, sold the homestead, and moved to Fort Worth, Texas. And here they are in Fort Worth. This is as I knew them before their deaths. So, their oldest daughter had a ranch south of Fort Worth. We still go there 4th of July, holidays. And there's always horses. So here's Henry on one of the horses from the ranch south of Fort Worth, reliving his cowboy days. And here they are as a retired couple in Fort Worth with their wonderful quilt now in Fort Worth, Texas. Okay. Annie and Henry. Everybody in the family has these portraits, thank goodness. Okay. Now, let's follow their daughter Ruth for a few minutes here. Okay, so they had 13 children, but only 9 lived to be adults. So we're going to follow their daughter Ruth, who was unique among her siblings in that not only did she graduate from high school there in Cordell on May 14th, 1925, but she returned for the high school reunions until 1995.
Wow.
Yeah. So there she is, a very demure little high school girl. There was remember those panoramic pictures? You may have some in your museum collections. Well, they made one for high school graduation. Guys are over here, young ladies are over here, and there's Ruth right there. Okay. This is the program from graduation day.
Oh, wow.
Well, not only did she go through high school, but she went to college for 2 years. Now, in this generation, it was very unusual for that to happen. She got that music gene. She went to Oklahoma Presbyterian College for Girls in Durant and majored in piano music. And the little demure high school girl, she's growing up. Watch the hairstyle. She bought this sheet music in Cordell at the local music store, although it has her married name on it. But her interest in music, along with her dad's, and now the present generation, my son, has the music gene, still going strong in the Bonham family. Okay. Second year, maybe she figured I need to earn a living, because that still happens today. So Ruth went to Southwestern State Teachers College. She received a lifetime certificate to teach in Oklahoma. This is elementary school. And now she was ready to launch her career as a single young woman in Oklahoma.
Wow.
This is the family favorite.
Yeah.
So she taught in various schools. Swan School near Thomas, Oklahoma. And then in what was called a consolidated school, maybe of little rural schools who just joined together near Godibo, and she taught there.
Was she a flapper?
Do you think? Oh yeah. And playing the piano? Oh, okay, yeah, all right. So here we get to the second quilt, which is right here in front of us. So her third rural teaching contract was at Mount Pleasant School, and that was near Cordell, about 2 miles east of the homestead. And you see with this map from the courthouse, we could plot where that school was. She taught grades 1 through 4 in one room, lived at home, and earned a great salary of $100 a month. And she stayed 4 years. And when she left, her mom and dad were already getting ready to leave, and they had received a quilt. Her students and their families presented her with this signature quilt when she moved to the big city during the Depression years. So that is the quilt we're going to look at this afternoon. Okay. Here are some blocks. These are also embroidered. No, I have not put them in the washing machine or the dryer. Neither one. Okay? And some more blocks. There are some of the same names on both quilts. There's some Bonhams. There's some other families that become very familiar as we study the quilt. Okay? 79 inches long, 64¼ inches wide. It's a little smaller than that one. 30 sections. Another variation of twist in the corner. Okay. So, to wrap up the quilt story, there was this lure back to Texas among Ruth's generation. Mom and Dad were already there. She went to Oklahoma City where she taught, and I found these pictures from the Oklahoma Municipal Library archives. She taught at this little school, Cary Elementary. And the 1940 federal census shows her settled in Fort Worth and living with 2 roommates in the downtown area. So this is a portrait done in Oklahoma City. So that would be, after she got the quilt, before Texas, okay? And then this is a studio in Fort Worth. So here we diverge from the story and have to end. She worked at Leonard's department store in the luggage department. We're in World War II times now. She met a handsome aeronautical engineer who had been in the Navy. They married right after Pearl Harbor, and she became a Rosie the Riveter. So this would be during the time of World War II when she was a Rosie the Riveter. Okay. So, when Fanny and Henry died, Ruth became the owner and custodian of not only her quilt, but also Fanny and Henry's quilt. And then it came to me. So, in terms of any kind of research of this time, there are some wonderful resources out there, absolutely wonderful. And many times, like when you visit the courthouses, you have to really turn on the charm and be ready to get in there and help the staff. And if you make a really good connection, these are the kinds of things that you can dig up. First of all, the family Bible. It still exists. When my mother needed a passport in 1950, none of that generation had a birth certificate. They had their names written in a family Bible. And she used a photostatic copy of the centerfold of the family Bible in order to get a passport to go to Greece. Photo albums, loose photos, you know, the shoebox of photos story, okay? The school records. Now Cordell has all the school records. I could track 31 of those cousins through school with the school records. Report cards, she saved them. Certificates, diplomas, oral histories, like the WPA, the material culture, these, the objects from Germany, you name it. All kinds of legal records. Birth, in some cases, birth records, marriage records. Fanny and Henry's marriage record is the third record in the first marriage book in the courthouse. And they let us see it. And of course, all of this to verify family stories. Was he really a cowboy? Come on. Everybody wanted to be a cowboy. Now, government documents. Treasure house of information. First of all, the United States Federal Census records. Every 10 years, we have a census. They're available up until 1940. You have to watch out because they're handwritten. The example I gave at first. Phonetic spelling, just plain incorrect spelling. It's like, who is Nettie? There was no Nettie in that generation. It was Anita. You know, and so you have to keep verifying and verifying. So there are challenges. Military records, I found draft cards for both generations. Immigration records, some European immigrants came through Ellis Island, some went up into Canada and came down, and the WPA, which I gave you some quotes from. And then other things that I could think of. All kinds of vital statistics, which you can either see online or you can write for them to have in your files. County courthouse records, the land ownership. We have copies of all of those land leases. School census, maps of settlement and ownership. This, I don't think we could have done this without this. And also museums, historical societies, libraries, and archives. Now, many times it's free to access these, but sometimes you will have to join a platform and you will have to pay. And I just gave one example, which I love, is Ancestry.com. And many of these kinds of records are available because of the billions of objects in their databases. But you piece together the story. First, you write down what you know, or what has been told to you. And then you have to set about to verify all of that. So, to round it up, when I'm ready to find an institution and they say, you know, well, prove it to me, I can gather all this up. I can gather all this up and I can say, I have these beautiful quilts. I will donate 2 quilt boxes and I will give to you all of copies of all of these records that show that this is a true Oklahoma quilt. One has its date on it, and the other we could track from the census records as to where she lived. So, So my intent today was to introduce you to some sources that are available on your computer, to lead you to further resources if you want to go to paid resources, and to show how you can backtrack to family quilts nobody knew anything about, except that was Fannie and Henry's and that was Ruth's, to put together an exhibition case, or just for your own family satisfaction to have a story to hand down to yet another generation. So thank you for listening, and we will do some questions. We got 5 minutes and then newbies on.
Hey, Vicki?
Yeah.
Can I just reinforce to everybody how important what Vicki just did? This is in the files at the Summit Historical Society, a signature quilt donated in 2008. It has no information. I didn't bring it, but I would like anybody local that would like to work on that. We have names. We will have to reverse what Vicki just shared with us to find the date. It doesn't even have a date. It is red and white, which it tells me certain time period. It has not been washed. We still have the names, and the names are embroidered. So these are really, really important documents that can lead you to the people, just like Vicki has. And I just applaud Vicki, your detective work. It is just fabulous. Thank you.
And you know what? Sometimes you make a contact and you decide, okay, I think I better just do this on my own. And I'll give this as a for instance. I contacted a state historical society saying, I'm looking for these 2 little towns, maybe they're ghost towns, where my mother taught. And I got an email that said, you have to send us $35 before we can start helping you.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and that was like throwing the gauntlet down. It's like, I said, I can do this myself. and with the help of more family records and more maps and counting the sections on that section, the land ownership map, I was able to put on the PowerPoint, here's Goaty Bow and here's Thomas and here, you know, these little towns that are almost, well, I looked up ghost towns of Oklahoma. There is a category called inhabited spaces that has, 17 people.
Right.
And so it can be done, but Sally's right. It is wonderful, exciting detective work. So if you are helping Sally in the Historical Society and you have this quilt with bare minimum information, I think you can add to that item history there with some information. And oh my God, you should see what I have ahead of me next week. I have a laundry basket full of printouts and other things that now need to be filed properly and labeled, and pictures to be returned, and cleanup work after a history project. But that will be just as enjoyable. And I can tell you right now, neither of my sons want this stuff. No, I mean, they're very glad for me to do all this work. I tried to give one of them his boom box from the 80s. I said, no, Mom, you just keep it in the garage. So I am at the stage of looking for institutions.
Wow.
Yes?
So for the family quilts, how will you?
So I've got a plan, and this afternoon, when we do the Q&A and everything, let's talk some more about that, because it's going to be Oklahoma versus Texas, just like a football game, and it's going to be, do I split this family collection between Oklahoma and Texas, or do I negotiate,
Yeah.
So
That's a tough one.
that's a toughie. Both are legitimate.
Yeah.
So I have to find a really professional curator in Costume Society who will work with me on this. Yeah. Okay, but we'll come back to it this afternoon. All right, Ms. Newby.
Everybody want to stretch for just a
Yeah,
minute?
stretch for a couple of minutes.